Ever heard a story that just makes you go, wait, what? Really? One of those things that makes you question, like, how power actually works.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think we've all encountered a few of those head scratchers.
Well, today we're diving into one of those stories. Um, it's about this powerful underworld figure. And get this, not only does he get a presidential pardon,
A presidential pardon.
yeah, but then he gets appointed a justice of the peace. You can't make this stuff up. The name to remember here is Gonawala Sunil. And let me tell you, his story is like something straight out of a movie.
It's wild, right? You've given me quite the collection of sources here. Articles from Colombo Telegraph, News First English, we've got Lankan Web, even Wikipedia, Lankan News, and the Sunday Times. So, a lot to unpack.
Yeah, real mixed bag. And today's goal is to kind of piece together the puzzle of this Gonawala Sunil, especially, those connections with the UNP, the United National Party.
UNP, yeah. Always interesting to see how those dots connect.
Right. And of course, all the controversies surrounding this guy. But listen, this isn't just, rehashing old news. I think it's about understanding how politics and the underworld sometimes, did this kind of intricate dance in Sri Lanka back then.
Yeah, that interplay is always fascinating and honestly a little unnerving sometimes.
A little bit, right. And what does that tell us about power, on a bigger scale? So let's start basic. Who was this Gonawala Sunil? What do we know about him?
Well, if you look at the sources, he was a pretty formidable thug operating mainly out of Kelaniya, not some small-time crook. It seems like he really had some serious influence in that area.
So a big player in the underworld scene. Okay, so how did he get on the authorities' radar? What landed him in trouble?
Well, the big turning point, the thing that really cemented his reputation was his conviction in the late 1970s for rape.
Rape. That's obviously a very serious charge.
Extremely serious. Several sources actually highlight how terrible this case was. They call it a contract rape. The victim was a woman from a prominent family.
Oh, wow. So this was targeted and planned. That's just horrible.
It was, and it happened right around the time of her marriage, too, so just an awful situation all around. This conviction, understandably, led to a pretty hefty prison sentence, around 10 years.
10 years. Yeah, that's a significant amount of time. You'd think that would, put a stop to his activities.
You would think so. But here's where things get really interesting, maybe even unbelievable.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So Sunil starts serving his sentence, right? But a few years in, something remarkable happens. July 7, 1981 marked the date.
Okay, July 7, 1981. What happened?
Well, on that day, Sunil is granted what became known as Sunil Samawa.
Sunil Samawa. What's that?
It basically translates to Sunil's amnesty. It happened to coincide with the 50th anniversary of Universal Adult Franchise in Sri Lanka. President J.R. Jayewardene announced a general amnesty for certain prisoners.
Ah, a general amnesty. Okay, so on the face of it, that sounds like a pretty standard, act of clemency. Happens sometimes.
It does. But that's where you got to dig a little deeper. Look at the details. Because the amnesty had specific criteria meant for first-time offenders.
First-time offenders, right?
Yeah. And people with less than 10 years left on their sentences. Plus, there was a list of excluded offenses, serious stuff, like murder, treason, robbery, crimes that would disqualify you from the amnesty.
So a lot of thought went into who would be eligible. Seems pretty clear-cut.
It does, until you get to this one glaring detail that the Colombo Telegraph article points out. You ready for this?
Hit me with it.
Rape. Rape was not on that list of exclusions.
Oh, wow. So it's like they specifically left that one out. I mean, come on. That can't be a coincidence.
Right. It seems pretty clear that the whole amnesty was designed with Gonawala Sunil in mind.
They created a loophole just for him.
It looks that way. And let me tell you, this pardon had a huge impact. The Colombo Telegraph points out how, Sunil's whole status changed, particularly in the eyes of other prisoners.
Yeah. How so?
Well, suddenly he wasn't just some guy who got lucky with a pardon. He was seen as this powerful figure.
Powerful.
Yeah, someone with direct connections to the government.
Like he could pull strings, get things done.
Exactly. Like he had some serious influence over the system. And even the junior prison staff, they started seeing him differently. Like, whoa, this guy's connected.
Customized loophole.
Yeah.
And then this sudden shift in how he's perceived. This story's getting wilder by the minute.
Buckle up because it gets even crazier.
Yeah.
So remember, he's released early, right? Well, after this whole pardon situation.
Yeah, after the Sunil Samawa thing.
Exactly. Sunil is appointed, get this, as an all-island justice of the peace.
Wait, hold on. A justice of the peace. This guy.
Yeah. The guy who was convicted of rape, now he's in a position of legal authority.
So he goes from being a convicted criminal to someone who, upholds the law.
Yeah.
That's just mind-boggling. How is that even possible?
Right. It really makes you wonder what was going on behind the scenes, who was pulling the strings, what kind of political calculations were they making?
I mean, it definitely suggests some serious influence and protection going on.
No doubt about it. It's like he was operating in a different reality, completely above the law.
Yeah, totally different rules for him. It's almost like a story of, someone who had a pact with the devil or something. But as with most things in life, this seemingly charmed existence couldn't last forever.
You're telling me there's more?
Sadly, there is. Sunil meets a violent end in 1988. Lankan describes it as an assassination. They even mention the weapon,
Yeah.
a T-56 firearm.
Mm.
And News First English has this, really sad detail that he left behind 2 children.
2 children. That's just heartbreaking no matter what their father did.
It is. So just to recap, we have this major underworld figure. He's convicted of a truly brutal crime.
And a powerful one at that, it seems.
Right. Powerful, convicted. He then gets this early release through what appears to be like a tailor-made amnesty. And after that...
Boom, appointed to a position of authority, only to meet his demise a few years later.
Yeah. Assassinated. I mean, this whole thing sounds like a script for a crime thriller or something. So this brings us to the next big question. Sunil's ties to the UNP, what did they really look like?
It's interesting because if you go through the sources, the picture's pretty consistent. This wasn't just some passive support for the UNP.
A guy who just votes for them?
No, not at all. This was active, vocal, dedicated support. They describe him as a regional leader within the party.
So an influential figure within the party structure.
Exactly. And of course, there's that whole connection with Ranil Wickremesinghe, who, back then was a rising star in the UNP, and importantly, the Minister of Education.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He held a pretty important position.
And it's the depth of this connection with Wickremesinghe that really stands out. We're not just talking about, shaking hands at rallies.
Right, this wasn't just surface-level stuff.
No, not at all. News First English and the Batalanda Commission report both mention that Sunil frequently hosted Wickremesinghe parties at his residence, things like that. There's even mention of this custom Sunil had of, personally greeting Wickremesinghe at the airport.
At the airport. So every time he flew back to Sri Lanka, Sunil would be there.
That's what News First English says. Katunayake Airport, to be precise. Imagine that. A prominent politician being personally welcomed by a known underworld figure. Talk about a strange juxtaposition.
That's just bizarre. What were people thinking? Or maybe more importantly, what were they not thinking?
I mean, it's not like it was a secret, right? News First English mentions that they even showed Wickremesinghe a photo of himself with Sunil, and he acknowledged the relationship just like that.
So it wasn't even something he tried to deny or downplay?
Nope. Which, in a way is almost more surprising. But it wasn't all parties and airport greetings. There's more to this connection, a much darker side to it, especially when you consider the whole Batalanda situation.
Yeah, Batalanda, that's a whole other can of worms.
It is. And the thing is, the Batalanda Commission report actually notes Sunil's frequent visits to this particular tourist bungalow.
A tourist bungalow. What's the significance of that?
Well, this bungalow was in the Batalanda complex where Wickremesinghe was residing at the time.
Ah, so Sunil was visiting Wickremesinghe's residence. That adds another layer to their relationship.
It does. And News First English also picks up on this detail. It makes you wonder what those visits were really about. I mean, we're talking about a powerful politician and a known thug having regular meetups.
In private.
Exactly. And, all this happens against the backdrop of the UNP's landslide victory in 1977. Lankan actually suggests that this victory created a political climate where, unfortunately, the use of thugs against rivals became, well, a bit of a norm.
So it's like this climate of almost political violence and intimidation that emerged.
That's the argument they make. And they specifically say figures like Sunil thrived in that kind of environment.
It's like that old saying, power corrupts. And when you have this mix of political power and underworld muscle, things can get really dangerous.
Sadly, that seems to be the case here. And Lankan goes even further with some pretty serious accusations. They claim that Sunil's guys, acting under the orders of this UNP minister, Cyril Matthew,
okay.
were involved in some nasty stuff, attacking students at Kelaniya University, specifically targeting left-wing and anti-UNP groups.
Oh, wow. So it went beyond just, intimidation and into actual violence.
And this wasn't a one-off thing, apparently. Lankan says this went on for years, starting in 1978. So you have this picture of Sunil's influence going way beyond the typical underworld activity.
Fleeing into universities, targeting specific groups. Man, this is heavy stuff.
It is, and Lankan even accuses Sunil of being directly involved in some pretty blatant electoral manipulation.
Like what?
Well, they claim he was key in stealing ballot boxes for the UNP during a by-election in Katana.
Stealing ballot boxes, that's just straight up election rigging.
Yeah. And then there's the Mulkirigala by-election. They say he played a major role there, too, ensuring the government's victory through, shall we say, less than legitimate means.
Wow. So we're talking about a guy deeply embedded in the UNP's political machine and not afraid to get his hands dirty.
Absolutely. And this all leads us to what might be the most disturbing part of this story, the Batalanda connection.
Oh, yeah, Batalanda. Let's talk about that. What makes that so significant and so controversial?
Okay, so the Batalanda thing is complicated and it's dark. It's not just about political ties. It's about alleged criminal activity, even violence against the state. So it starts with Ranil Wickremesinghe offering housing.
Offering housing.
Yeah, in the Batalanda housing complex to police officers. Now, according to Wickremesinghe himself, this was in response to an attack on the Thuggery police station.
Ah, right. That was a pretty big incident.
It was July 1989, explosives, gunfire. The officer in charge, Lalith Mahanama, was killed, along with other officers and some of the attackers.
A really tragic event. But how does this connect to Sunil?
Well, here's the thing. One of the attackers who died at Thuggery, his name was Sumith Pereira, also known as Kalua. And guess what? News First English is very clear on this. Sumith Pereira was Gonawala Sunil's nephew.
His nephew. So a direct family connection to the attack on the police station. Wow, that's a huge revelation.
Yeah, it adds a whole other dimension to Sunil's story. And it gets even more complicated. Sumith's father, Gonawala Pereira, he was one of 7 brothers. And one of those brothers was Sunil.
Okay, so we have a direct link between Sunil, a known criminal figure, and this attack on law enforcement.
It's a pretty damning connection. But wait, there's more. This is where things get really murky. News First English reports that Shelton Pereira, another brother of Sunil and another uncle of Sumith, was arrested.
Arrested.
In connection with the Thuggery attack. So 2 of Sunil's brothers potentially involved in this major incident.
That's a lot of family ties to a very serious crime.
It is. But here's where the political influence angle comes in. The Batalanda Commission report, as cited by News First English, says Shelton was released.
Released. Just like that.
Pretty much. After his wife went to Wickremesinghe and explained the situation. Now, this raises some serious questions about potential interference in a criminal investigation.
Yeah, you have to wonder why a politician would intervene so quickly and so directly in a case like this.
It's definitely suspicious. And remember, this is a case involving an attack on a police station, a very serious offense. It just doesn't add up unless there's something else at play.
It's like, what kind of hold did Sunil or maybe his family have over Wickremesinghe that he would step in like that?
And the whole thing gets even creepier when you factor in the location. Sunil himself was actually living in a house right next to the alleged torture chamber in the Batalanda housing complex.
So right in the middle of it all.
Up until his death in '88, this is according to Lankan, and it places him in very close proximity to some really dark stuff.
Talk about being in the thick of it.
Mm-hmm.
You have to wonder what he knew, what he might have seen going on there.
And then there's Vincent Pereira. He was the caretaker of the Batalanda tourist bungalow where Wickremesinghe lived.
The same bungalow Sunil visited.
Exactly. And both News First English and Lankan report on his testimony to the Batalanda Commission. He stated that Sunil was a regular visitor there, going to see a powerful politician during the time Wickremesinghe was living there.
So Sunil frequently visiting Wickremesinghe at this place, later linked to some really bad things. That's pretty incriminating.
It is. And here's the truly disturbing part. Vincent Pereira vanished.
Vanished, like disappeared.
After giving this testimony, poof, gone. Nobody knows what happened to him.
Oh, that's just chilling.
Yeah.
It really paints a dark picture of what was happening at Batalanda. It's like a scene out of a mafia movie or something.
It does. So let's just recap this whole Batalanda thing. Sunil's nephew was involved in the attack on the police station. Another brother was arrested and then suspiciously released. Sunil himself was living right next to a suspected torture site.
And he was a regular visitor to a powerful politician at that same location.
Yeah. And then a key witness who could corroborate all of this just disappears. It's a really unsettling and disturbing aspect of the story. And it leads us directly to the many controversies and allegations swirling around Sunil, especially regarding his early release from prison and his connection to Ranil Wickremesinghe.
Right. So what are some of the key accusations that come up in the sources?
Well, one of the biggest questions, and Lankan News really emphasizes this, is whether Wickremesinghe himself played a direct role in securing Sunil's presidential pardon back in '81.
The Sunil Samoa.
Exactly. They specifically point to his rape conviction, even naming the victim as Margaret, a 21-year-old woman from Katawatha. Adding those details really brings home the gravity of the situation.
It does. You're not just talking about some abstract legal maneuvering. You're talking about a real person who suffered a terrible crime. And they're implying that a politician might have helped the perpetrator escape justice.
That's the insinuation. And Lankan News goes even further, claiming that Wickremesinghe actively lobbied President Jayewardene for Sunil's release.
Lobbied him.
Through letters, they say, and numerous personal visits. So, not a passive thing, but a sustained effort by a rising political star to get a convicted rapist out of prison.
Well, it's a huge accusation to make.
Yeah.
And it really raises the question of why. What was the motive? What was the nature of their relationship that would warrant such a thing?
You have to wonder, what did Sunil offer in return? What leverage did he have? Or was it something else entirely?
This is serious stuff. And it seems to align with the statement Chandrika Kumaratunga made back in 1999. The Sunday Times reported on this. She was at an election rally, and she brought up Sunil's case. She specifically mentioned Wickremesinghe being in the Mahara area with Sunil on an election day.
And she didn't hold back. She described Sunil as a man who raped a doctor's daughter in Colombo, went to prison, but came out in 3 years and was given posts. Talk about a public call-out.
Right, and coming from a major political figure like Kumaratunga, it adds a lot of weight to the whole controversy surrounding Sunil's pardon and his subsequent appointments.
No doubt about it. It throws the whole thing into a harsh spotlight. But it's important to acknowledge that the Batalanda Commission, despite noting Sunil's UNP support, didn't find any evidence of him or his family being officially affiliated with any other political party.
So no formal ties, at least according to the commission.
Right. But that doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't a close personal relationship or even some kind of quid pro quo going on. You know, sometimes those lines between formal and informal influence can be pretty blurry, especially when you're talking about the underworld.
Yeah, those lines can get real hazy. And then there's this whole other incident that adds to the sense of, danger and impunity. The case of Rohitha Priyadarshana. He was the OIC of the Crimes Division.
The guy responsible for investigating serious crimes.
Exactly. And News First English and Lankan both mentioned that he was actively looking into Sunil's family. And after he arrested Sunil's brother, Tudor Pereira.
This was in February 1990.
Yeah. Not long after that arrest, Priyadarshana himself was abducted.
Abducted. And tragically, it's believed he was murdered.
Oh, man. That's just awful. It's like even after Sunil's death, his network or his influence was still powerful enough to silence someone who was getting too close.
It really makes you think about the reach of this guy's influence and how deep it went. It's a very disturbing thought.
Deeply disturbing. So with all this in mind, I think it's important to zoom out for a second to understand where Sunil fits in the bigger picture of the Sri Lankan underworld.
That's a great point. It helps provide some context. Luckily, Lankan and Wikipedia give us some insight into that.
Perfect. So what do they say about that whole scene?
Well, Lankan kind of traces this evolution of the underworld in Sri Lanka. They talk about a shift from those, more localized village thugs to these more organized urban gangster types. This happened in the late 60s and 70s.
A change from small-time stuff to something bigger, more dangerous?
Yeah. And they put Sunil right in that timeline, suggesting that while, sure, earlier figures might have been involved in violence with Sunil and his contemporaries, it was different. It was a new era. They say these guys were responsible for more brutal crimes, things like rape, and that they were more deeply intertwined with the political scene.
And this was especially true after 1977, with the UNP's big win.
Exactly. The argument is that this politicization of the underworld basically created the perfect conditions for these more dangerous, more connected criminals to thrive.
It's a chilling thought, but it makes sense. And what about Wikipedia? What do they have to say about Sunil?
Well, they list him as a notorious criminal leader. No surprises there. They also mention his alleged involvement in that 1983 Welikade prison massacre.
Oh, yeah, right. That was a huge event. A lot of people died.
Tragic. But to be fair, our other sources don't explicitly confirm he was involved in the planning of that.
Yeah, it seems more like speculation on Wikipedia's part. Maybe they need to update their sources.
Maybe so. But they do confirm his '81 conviction for the rape of a 17-year-old girl. though there's a slight discrepancy in the victim's age compared to the other accounts.
A minor detail, but still it's important to point out those inconsistencies.
Absolutely. And then Wikipedia adds these really interesting but potentially unsubstantiated details.
Like what?
They mention these allegations that Sunil himself was abused by older men with ties to the UNP. And then they say that he acted as a bodyguard for Ranil Wickremesinghe.
A bodyguard. Seriously.
Apparently, this was during Wickremesinghe's time as Minister of Education. Now, we have to be careful with Wikipedia. Sometimes the information's not super reliable.
Yeah, it's definitely not the most scholarly source.
Agreed. But these claims are interesting nonetheless, especially the bodyguard thing. It just reinforces that image of a very close relationship between Sunil and a powerful political figure.
And maybe a relationship that went beyond just, casual friendship.
Right, exactly. There might have been a whole other layer of maybe dependence or even exploitation going on.
And that's what makes this whole story so fascinating and so disturbing, right? It's like the more you dig, the more layers of complexity you find. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is just how intricate and honestly how unsettling this whole story is. We've got this man, Gonawala Sunil, clearly a powerful figure in the Kelaniya underworld, with a serious criminal history.
But also a man who was, deeply connected to the ruling party, and specifically to Ranil Wickremesinghe.
And despite a conviction for a violent crime, he receives this very suspicious presidential pardon and then somehow gets appointed to a position of legal authority.
It's almost like something out of a dystopian novel. And then you add in the whole Batalanda connection.
Yeah.
The family ties to that attack on the police station, the suspicious release of his brother, Sunil, living right next to the alleged torture site, and his frequent visits to this powerful politician at the same location.
Plus the disappearance of a key witness. It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it raises so many questions that, we still don't have clear answers to. How extensive was Sunil's influence? What were the real reasons behind the political protection he clearly enjoyed? And how did his actions, his connections, really impact Sri Lankan politics during that time?
It's like we've uncovered the tip of the iceberg, but there's still so much beneath the surface.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really important point, a question for our listeners to ponder. What does Gonawala Sunil's story tell us about the relationship between political power and the underworld in any society? What happens when those lines get blurred? What are the consequences for justice, for good governance?
That's the big question, isn't it? It forces us to think about the nature of power, about accountability, and how easily those things can be manipulated.
Sunil's story is a reminder that those things, those dynamics, are often happening in the shadows, and they can have a profound and often negative impact on the fabric of a nation. So I think that's what we're left with. A lot of questions, a sense of unease, and a renewed awareness of just how complex and how fragile those systems of power can be.
It's a story that's hard to forget, and hopefully one that prompts us to be more vigilant, more questioning, and to never take those systems for granted. Because as we've seen, when those lines get blurred, the consequences can be very real and very lasting.
Absolutely. So keep asking those questions, keep digging deeper, and never stop being curious about the world around you. And until next time, keep exploring.
Keep exploring.